Just because we're commemorating it today, tomorrow, Wednesday, it's not enough. We have to continue the conversation always until restitution and reparation is had for those descendants of that tragedy on that day. So in recent years, of course, there's been talk of restitution for the survivors and descendants, but once again, it has not come. New America fellow and author Caleb Gayle explores that and more in his New York Times Magazine article, 100 Years After the Tulsa Massacre. What does justice look like? And Caleb Good, Caleb is with us this morning, and thank you for being with us here on BNC. I read it, and I love the column. And you grew up in Tulsa. You're from Tulsa. What jumped out to me is I know a lot of people here in this country did not know about what was going on, Tulsa Massacre, the real story. But even you as a kid, you didn't know a lot about what happened on those days 100 years ago. Why?
Yeah, I mean, not know a lot is pretty generous. I knew nothing, right? It wasn't in school, right? Oklahoma history classes, at least the ones that I took growing up, didn't mention it. U.S. history classes didn't mention it. And to the extent that my Oklahoma history books did or my teachers did, it was a short blip. So quite frankly, it was not just the fact that textbooks didn't mention it, but there was a long campaign of silence, right? Immediately following what happened in 1921 that persisted for decades to try and ensure that that story never got out. So it wasn't just me, but hosts of people who not only were born in Tulsa, but were shaped by that very community and shaped often by the trauma of that incident that didn't even know that that happened.
So, something that this devastating that wipes out a way of life, wipes out people. Tell us about the research. What did that lead to today?
Yeah, the lingering effects, essentially. Yeah, I mean, look, you can look at Tulsa now and see the deep inequality there, right? Black Tulsans are about twice as likely to be unemployed.
Mm-hmm.
On average, the Black Tulsans are 6 years or live 6 years less, right? Or expected to live 6 years less than the average Tulsan in Tulsa County. And even more so when you look at even the divisions between kind of the zip code that occupies most of Black Wall Street or former Black Wall Street and the zip codes that kind of represent some of the wealthiest parts of Tulsa, you see almost a 11 to 14 year life expectancy gap, right? So just in terms of real lives, like years lived, right? There's a significant gap there, and on top of that, our schools are nowhere near as good. We have a food desert. We just celebrated a fresh grocery store being built in Tulsa after almost
Wow.
a decade of not even having that. So the disparities are quite significant and quite tangible. And even those who don't even agree with reparations, like Mayor Bynum, even can recognize and even state just how severe that disparity is.
Yeah, and there's people thriving on the other side of the track, so to speak, as well. So you see that disparity
Yeah.
from what came about 100 years ago. But your column is 100 years after the Tulsa Massacre. What does justice look like? And we've been talking about reparations, and just like the nation when it comes to reparations, we just talked about this. Tulsa doesn't seem like they want to budge when it comes to that type of stuff. So what form, in your opinion, does it come in? What does justice look like?
Yeah, I mean, the landscape in Tulsa is pretty clear, right? You have some who believe that, building a history center called Greenwood Rising and memorializing what happened is a sufficient means by which restitution can come. And then a large subset of the population that are in Black Wall Street that grew up in North Tulsa have a very different view that just the construction of a history museum deals with the acknowledgement, but that doesn't actually deal with any of the atonement. It doesn't fix anything. It doesn't lead to economic prosperity. And so, yes, there are lawsuits that are happening in order to try and get after that, right, through a very unique legal principle called public nuisance law. But there are also very serious policy solutions that can go directly to not just repairing the harm, but also kind of crafting a future of opportunity for lots of Black Tulsans, which can be replicated in other cities as well, not just Tulsa.
Yeah, we've seen it in, Evanston, Illinois, other places, and wonder
Yeah.
how far this can go. The Greenwood district was destroyed, burned to the ground. What happened to that land that was owned by Black people? We know the insurance companies didn't do what they were contractually obligated to do, but what happened to that land?
Yeah, in fact, one of the few people made whole on their insurance claims was a white shop owner who had his ammunition
Mm.
reimbursed effectively. But when you actually look at the land, a host of things have been done, right? So right after Black Wall Street burnt, Black people didn't sit and rest on their laurels and their sorrows. No, we began to rebuild almost immediately, right? Almost as the
Mm-hmm.
embers smoldered. But what ended up happening was that we had a federal program called Urban Renewal that dispersed billions of dollars to cities that allowed them to declare certain areas as blighted, leverage something called eminent domain to supposedly renew those areas. But as James Baldwin once said,
Yeah.
urban renewal is oftentimes Negro removal. So what ended up happening is that they cleared large portions of residential areas in Black Wall Street, and then built, in fact, a highway that splits directly through historic Black Wall Street, which kind of devastated the community even further. So, as some of the
Mm.
descendants, survivors of the massacre say, we were first kind of destroyed through the massacre, but then we were destroyed yet again through urban renewal, or as they would say, Negro removal. So a lot of that land
Mm-hmm.
is can't even recognize what was once there oftentimes.
Yeah, it's interesting, sad, I mean, tragic what you're talking about, Caleb, because as you were explaining that eloquently as you did, informatively, I couldn't help but think about Hurricane Katrina. You could have said Hurricane Katrina and inserted New Orleans
Mm-hmm.
and said the same thing. The
Mm-hmm.
same things
Mm-hmm.
are happening
Displace them.
today. So you mentioned lawsuits, you mentioned, programs, a museum. What should be the focus when you talk about justice for Greenwood, for all of us?
Sure. I think I would probably align myself with an all of the above approach, right? Because you do need to acknowledge, you do need to recognize what happened, and you do need to reform curricula, as some folks have been doing and have done. You do need to have a place where people can come
Yeah.
to discuss these issues, to view what happened, because to some extent, relive and understand what exactly was lost. But then you also need to ensure that that's not a period to the sentence. That's in fact just a comma, right? That we're not
Hmm.
punctuating ultimately what we're doing by just remembering what happened, but then also identifying
Mm.
tangible ways, not just that force the remaining survivors to sue for restitution, but that our city can actually wrap our arms around, our country can wrap our arm around, repairing the damage done, not just, of course, in Tulsa, but in so many other parts of this country where devastation has occurred in very tangible ways. We're not talking about trying to trace this thing back 400 years. We're talking about tracing this thing directly back 100 years where we can actually
Yeah.
identify the dollar amount lost by each person in that neighborhood.
Yeah, and you definitely got to get that done because reparations to be had there. But I love your column because you wrapped around what's actually happening today, not just in the nation, but in Tulsa. 4 years ago, the shooting death of Terrence Crutcher, who was killed by a cop and was acquitted. The cop was acquitted in his shooting death, and they wanted to get justice there. So I have to ask you, where are race relations today in the city of Tulsa?
Yeah, I mean, first, it wasn't that she was just acquitted; she received back pay, right? Officer Betty
Mm-hmm.
Shelby also now does lectures for police departments uh, to help their officers learn how to deal with "quote unquote" trauma. And in fact, she is a deputy sheriff
Wow.
in the neighboring county, right?
Mm.
So just wanted to make
Wow.
sure we put a final point
Wow.
on that. Where race relations stand today, I think there is a broader potentially acknowledgement that things are not as good for Black people. as they otherwise would be. But then the impetus to then implement the sort of policy solutions to change the experience for Black Americans, specifically Black Tulsans, for the better is lacking, period. And that's even been done with the implementation of something called these equality indicators that demonstrated just how severely, unequal and inequitable the treatment of Black Tulsans are. But have things been done to repair that? Not so much, no.
The beat
Well,
goes on.
the beat goes on, and the mayor is not focused on any kind of reparations. That's not his focus. Caleb, listen, hey, if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, check out Caleb Gayle's article in the New York Times Magazine. It is excellent. Your voice, important, necessary. Keep at it. Thanks so much for starting your day with us, Caleb. We hope you'll be back, too.